We decided to play God. Create life. And when that life turned against us, we comfort ourselves in the knowledge that it was the Cylons that were flawed. But the truth is, we are the flawed creation. We jump into uncharted space. We're a long way from home. Limited supplies, limited fuel, no allies, and now no hope. As of this moment, we are at war.
Sooner or later, the day comes when you can't hide from the things you've done.
Moments ago, this ship received word of a Cylon attack against our home worlds is underway.
You're the new breed of Cylon. The last time anybody saw the Cylons, they looked more like walking toasters.
I have feelings, hopes, wants, and what I want most of all is for you to love me.
The Cylons look like us, that any one of us can be a Cylon. You're gonna die in this body.
My consciousness will just be transferred to another one.
Another Cylon!
Humanity's children are returning home today.
Let's get this ship into the fight.
Get down!
Zach failed basic flight.
He should not have been there. He was only doing it for you.
Thought I should confess my sins.
How's the wife?
I promise you one thing. We will make it.
We have 50,000 people left. The war is over.
It hasn't begun yet.
Hi everyone, welcome once again to Geek Fest Rants. My name is Carlos Perone and joining me today is James. Say hello, James.
Hi again.
Today we are continuing on a previous episode subject of Battlestar Galactica. This time around we are tackling the second reincarnation, I guess you can call it, of the Galactica story, which is not a sequel, but what back then was called a reimagining, which is a very popular kind of term that it's used these days, or rebooting. It's a way of kind of redoing something and starting from scratch, but you kind of have to remain loyal to the story and to the concepts of the original show. What happened was, at a certain point when the original show ended, there was a void of, almost 15 years, 20 years, where there was no Galactica television show, movies, anything like that. But there were some little bits and pieces of comics or books, even some toys that were still kind of trickling out here and there. James, why don't you tell us a little bit about, especially the books, because that seems to be the thing that held most of the whatever strength or legitimacy that Galactica had left.
Well, the books that were put out during the time of the original Galactica in the late 70s, early 80s were mostly tie-ins to the episodes, yeah, which I bought. They were here and there a little extra stuff, but basically the authors took the script and then just expanded a little bit a few things we might not have seen on screen. And they did that for, I feel like, anywhere from 14 to 18 books. I can't remember, but I know towards the end they actually did stories that didn't actually appear on television. So I don't know if they were from unused scripts or completely new stories from an outside author. But they were interesting. Well, years later, Richard Hatch, the star of the original Battlestar Galactica, who played Captain Apollo, thought it good to resurrect this. He was loyal to the character. There were other actors who were still around who liked those roles, and they put together almost like a fan-made trailer on what could be a new Battlestar Galactica called The Second Coming. Now, it was made with private money. No studio was behind it. There was no guarantee this would have come to anything. But it made the rounds of the conventions. This is before the internet.
Yeah.
It made the rounds of the conventions, and he went, almost like he went door to door, trying to sell this, and people loved it. It just really had a nice feel to it. And it portrayed what would happen after the original series ended, not taking into account Galactica 1980. And people had high hopes, and it actually generated a lot of buzz to get people saying, hey, we want Battlestar Galactica. We want you to do this. But no studio was interested. Apparently, they just didn't feel the time was right. But what I think once again helped Battlestar Galactica was the Star Wars prequels. And people don't put it into perspective, but there wasn't anybody demanding other than the loyal fans. But as soon as the prequels came back, other companies started to say, hey, wait a minute, Star Wars, do we have something? It was almost a repeat of the late 70s. Do we have something of our own? Is there something we can create? In the meantime, that didn't get anywhere. So Richard Hatch created a new Battlestar Galactica following up after the original in a book form. And they were actually pretty good at first.
Took a few years.
Yeah, he wrote several of them. Some of them had co-authors, things like that. But in the beginning, it was actually interesting, and it followed along, and I read them, and I actually enjoyed them. But boy, by the third or fourth one, it started to fall apart. I feel like the Richard Hatch from Survivor started writing them rather than the Richard Hatch from Battlestar Galactica, because it just was really convoluted. And there's been no real explanation of it, but I feel like Richard Hatch's name was on it and somebody else started writing, or somebody was editing it that didn't even know the characters, because it just was crap. And I don't know if other ones came out afterwards. I just stopped. I thought it was awful. But in the meantime, the prequels come out, and people start scrambling for new science fiction. And the Sci-Fi Channel decided, it seems like out of nowhere, to create a new Battlestar Galactica. And when they announced it, it caused quite a stir, because the person who was going to be in charge of it was Ron Moore, who had been known for Star Trek. Now, people started worrying a little bit, like, is he going to...
Mixing of the franchises?
Yeah, how is he going to do it? Because by the end of Star Trek that involved him, I think it got a little watered down and got a little convoluted. Now, I wasn't as loyal to the end, and I watched sporadically Deep Space Nine and Voyager, that I just didn't feel like it was the same show. And I had wondered if, hey, he jumped off of that potentially sinking ship. I didn't know much about him and what he was capable of.
Well, the premise of the show, obviously, it had to follow the original premise of the show. It's a reboot, yes, but one of the things they had kind of announced early on was that they were playing off a little bit, quite a bit, on the post 9/11 vibe that the country had.
There was a bit of a shock, something that happened. How do people respond to
Right,
it?
and in a way, the original story, you have a situation like that where something happens, they get surprised by some military action, and all of a sudden, they're running for cover. And there was a vibe of that kind of recovery, kind of feel. At the same time, because they wanted to make the show a little different, they started to announce a couple of things that were going to be a little different about the show. And the most notable thing that fans, the red flags went up immediately, was the casting of Starbuck.
Well, the only people that were really very excited about hearing this, the average people didn't care whether Battlestar Galactica
It's just
lived
another
or
old
died.
goofy sci-fi
So
show.
the only people that did show any initial surprise were the loyal fans, who then find out that Starbuck is now going to be a woman. Boomer is now going to be a woman. And I guess I can understand, if I recall that time period, I was a little disappointed. How could that be? Now, I'm almost shocked when Starbuck's a man when I watch the original, because I'm so ingrained with the new Starbuck and the new characters.
So the build-up to the show, which, again, it was initially rolled out as a TV movie, as a multi-part, two-part, I think, TV movie.
Yeah, basically like a 4-hour movie.
Right.
So.
And as it's coming, the vibe from the fans, it's very negative. A lot of people, between Ron Moore's Star Trek crossing over vibe and the major characters being switched, in terms of roles and sexes.
And as we started to see some production clips or production art and things, it was the same but different. The ship was essentially the Galactica as we know it. The Vipers were pretty much the same look, a little bit modernized. But the Cylon Raiders were completely different.
Yeah.
It was changed that instead of Apollo being a name, it was more a call sign. Starbuck was more a call sign of a fighter pilot. And when Adama was cast, I was surprised that they chose Edward James Olmos, because he's not somebody I had thought of. I was a huge fan of Miami Vice, and I would always think of Lieutenant Castillo, and also his work after Miami Vice as an actor in some really good movies.
A whole bunch of movies, yeah.
He was more earthbound. He was more of a, that type of, solid leader guy, but more,
Right. The other big...
more of his Latino roots. Like he seemed to be like, those kind of strong characters, But like I said, I never thought of him as an Adama type.
Right. The other thing that was leaked out, I guess, or promoted, is the fact that not only were we going to have Cylons that were going to look a little different than the robotic ones, but there was going to also be very human-looking Cylons too. So that also kind of like triggered, oh, wait a minute, is this a production value problem? They can't afford the effects, so they're going to have humans
And
playing
it might
them?
have been, but it was brilliant in hindsight.
But again, at first the vibe was very iffy.
Yeah.
And
one thing that I was actually, back to Edward James Olmos, I was impressed with. He said he was willing to take this role if it didn't become Creature of the Week or it didn't become Star Trek. And that made me feel a little better, like, okay, well, that's good. But I still just wasn't sold on it. And I know at the time I was very adamant that I just wasn't going to get involved. It's been done, fine, good. Hopefully it's nice, but I'm not going to jump on board.
So the first part airs, and I'm really all for it. I liked it, and I'm almost like, oh, crap, this is actually good.
And I watched it on delay. You had, I think, watched it probably the night it aired. I think the next night was part 2. I watched it the next day in the morning, preparing for the second part later on in that day, and I was blown away. I remember it changed me in a way like I didn't expect it to. Like, it was just very serious and actually very moving in some respects. And I later watched documentaries and, I listened to podcasts from the creators, how they made a point of saying they wanted to take it serious in the sense that these people just lost everything. This is not a joke. Whereas the first one, the first Galactica, okay, we're all going to pile into the Ark. Let's get going. How does this really affect people? And it was really moving. I was very impressed at the whole thing, the production values. I didn't hate the new Starbuck. I liked her. I didn't hate the new Boomer. She was very good. The look of the ship, the manner in which they planned this out. This was something that was well thought out. And
as to how serious
I was sold on it.
As to how serious they were taking the show, from the beginning, the show really didn't have too much trouble delving into some very seriously shocking areas. Not only the first initial attack, but right before the attack, you see what's called Six, the main Cylon character. She's pretending to care, I guess, about what's happening around her, and she's blending in with people, and she wants to touch a little baby in a stroller or something, and you hear, the parents kind of look the other way, and she kind of hear like a snapping sound, and then she kind of walks away, and you hear the parents screaming because she just basically snapped the kid's neck.
It was not shy.
And it was like, what? You're like, what the hell just happened? Yeah. And, there were moments like that in the show where, where typically or stereotypically certain cliches happen where things are resolved in a okay manner. Here they went a completely different direction. There's another scene where one of the ships that they are helping to kind of get away from everything doesn't have the jump drives. And there's an exchange between characters, one of them being a little girl. And they're talking about, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be fine. And then they realize that ship has no capabilities of jumping, and they have to get out of that area, and they have to basically abandon thousands of people, including this little girl that they just purposely made you aware of her, from a writing point of view, to give you another punch in the stomach.
Yes, several times throughout the series, they show the consequences of certain leadership decisions and how it affects other, I guess another 9/11 throwback. There was always talk about, did the government or was the government prepared to shoot down that plane over
They had a similar scenario.
And they had a situation where they think a ship has been compromised, and Apollo is forced to make the call. He's compelled to do it, and then as a person, he has to make the call, is he going to do this or not? And he does. And then he has to live with his decisions.
Right.
Did those people die, or were they truly killed ahead of time?
And I think up to the last second, they still don't know because they couldn't get a response. But there was like blood on the walls or something.
There were silhouettes in the window, so they didn't know what they were. And it's very moving. And I don't want to overlook something else that made this a big different type of show, is the music. And the music, right from the beginning, was very moving. And the opening scene shows an original Galactica-type shuttlecraft.
Right, the decommissioning.
Docking at a deep space type meeting place. No Cylon has ever come, they say, so on and so forth. We think this is a routine nothing. And then all of a sudden, Six appears. Very feminine, very, very glamorous looking. And this starts the ball rolling for the attack. And just the way the music builds up. I mean, you can't not be sucked in. And if you're not, I guess you're just not interested in that type of subject
The show
matter.
has its own themes, obviously, but it's funny because they do kind of pay homage to the original, because at the
lot of
decommissioning
ways.
ceremony, they're playing the Galactica theme.
And they're showing old Cylon,
Yeah,
the original
yeah.
TV
At
series.
the
Cylon.
museum, like
the older Vipers are styled
Yep.
more like the Vipers we know, rather than the more sophisticated, high tech.
Even the original Cylon motherships, I think, the base stars, they're shown as models of the previous war.
Yeah, in the 50-year-old war type
So,
thing. So it actually gave a little something to the fans like
Right.
me, who were trying to be more loyal to their
even
old
though,
girlfriend.
Even though they're rebooting the show, they're also incorporating the original one
Yeah, they
into
didn't stomp
the
on
new
the old-
history
the
of
old
the show.
information.
Right. I mean, granted, they do change a lot of things about the story, but they are giving little winks and nods to the original. And like I said before, what would be the national anthem, I think, of the colonies is the original, theme, which is like, oh, that's so funny.
And I'm jumping way ahead, but even at the end, all the way to the very end, they use the initial prologue music as part of the finale.
Yeah, they kind of kept that going throughout the series.
So they were very loyal throughout the series. To anybody who was a fan of the original could feel good watching this. So I would say the first season for sure dealt with how the psychological effects of people who are now on the run, a very civilized society, how they are now on the run, and how people now have to scramble for their position. It's now more militaristic. It's a martial law, but they're trying hard to keep the loyalty, and that there's a
the
president
ongoing,
and there's some sort of hierarchy. The one thing to this day that bugs me is there's a number being put on a whiteboard every week, or discussed at the open every week, of anywhere from 45,000 to about a low 50,000, low 50,000s at the initial. But somehow we've got about 50 media people. And it's just like, you've got enough people that maybe might fill Yankee Stadium on a good playoff day, and you've got more media people than you do pilots.
Well,
and I thought that was kind of goofy, and I understand that they needed a place for the media and stuff like that. They needed to show that. But that part I thought was silly.
I think the way they worked it was
a little aside.
Because of the decommissioning ceremony, the media was
the
there
media
for that.
happened to be there, but they still let them. It's like
they let them act.
I think if I had to take over in a situation, I'd say, okay, we have 2 cameramen and we have 2 interviewers.
Well,
everybody else, you go work on the Tillium ship.
That was one of the main themes of the show: is how do you balance out civilian government versus military dictatorship.
Yeah.
And it was a balancing act every episode of the president trying to do what you're supposed to do from a civilian perspective, to how much do you let, are you letting the army do things, or is the army letting you do things? Who's letting who do things?
Yeah.
Obviously it helped.
I think I would have rather had Adama be the guy in charge, but I guess there's a certain group of people that feel like
but
the president
they worked
should be.
it into the show in terms of, not only do you have that ongoing dilemma, but then you end up with a romantic relationship between the two. So it's very multi-level of the, I let you do this, but I can't let you do that. But wait a minute, you're supposed to do what I want you, that kind of weird stuff.
Well, there were various points in the first couple of seasons. Now, I have to explain to people who may not have checked this show out yet. The seasons weren't like we know, okay, it's a 20-episode season. Seasons on Sci-Fi Channel ranged anywhere from 12 to 15 episodes.
Yeah.
And then a 2-year break sometimes. It just felt like sometimes we were waiting forever, because the show lasted the equivalent of 4 seasons with some mini episodes and special movies, things like that. But one season might have been broken up into 6 to 10 episodes, and then the second half aired six months later. Yeah. It felt like it went from 2003 to about 2009. It just felt like it took forever to get to that point. But there were some key elements in those seasons, one being when Adama got shot. Now, Adama is the leader, the figurehead, the guy who has created this plan, it turns out, to a place he didn't even know if it existed himself. He was just trying to generate some hope and get people to have high morale. But then once the dad, the leader, the father figure has been taken out of the equation, how do the other characters react? And it seemed like they lost their mind.
Well, not only that, but the person that shot him, again, it's one of those points in the series where you realize, wait a minute, they're screwing with the characters that I think I know.
Yeah.
And you kind of knew from the beginning, because in the beginning of the pilot, you realize that
this Boomer character is really
not
a Cylon.
Exactly who you think
we
it
know
is.
it, they don't. But at the time when Adama is shot, they threw us for that loop with this character who we kind of were liking at this point. But then the other leadership characters of Saul, Ty, and Apollo, and the president, it seems like their roles just started getting very blurry,
Right.
and how they handled adversion and how they handled each other. And by the time Adama recovered and came back, it was almost like,
What the hell have you done?
What have you done to my house? Why are all the chairs upside down? So that was like the first main scenes where we can tell it's not the same. These characters are really dealing with something. And that's the thing a lot of these shows, oh yeah, it's an exodus. We have to, but people act differently. Like, look, if there's snow on the ground, people can't drive in our society.
Right.
So imagine now, there's nothing, there's no stores. People would be like running around like chickens without heads.
Right, and again, this lasts a long time because there's many, many seasons we're dealing with. But you get certain characters who, when you look at the entire arc of the character, it's like you have people that are very brave and they kind of step up and do brave things. You have people that are very brave and nice and completely lose their mind and can't handle it. You have people who turn against each other, people that kill themselves.
They go back and forth, yeah.
People who are wonderful people, and then they end up betraying the main group. You get the whole spectrum.
There's a whole moral palette here. I think the series was one of the best ever, up until the point where they got to an arc called New Caprica.
Well, that was a big,
A
shocking...
lot had gone on until then.
Yeah. But not so... In terms of structure, it's very difficult, or it's very unusual. I don't know if I've ever seen that done in a television show where all of a sudden you jump forward.
Did you know that was coming?
No.
I didn't either.
No
and
clue.
all of a sudden, one year later.
What just happened?
And you see how these characters have now... Basically, for people who haven't seen it, the characters reach a point and reach a planet after... At this point in the show, it was probably months, maybe even close to a year at this point,
Right.
of being on the run.
Right.
And fatigue has set in, and morale has dropped, and they get to a place where it seems like they can
Right. They know
drop
it's not,
anchor.
They know it's not Earth,
but they feel they can drop
It's like
anchor.
it's good enough.
And they do, and everybody goes crazy on getting there and saying, this is our new home, and things don't turn out quite as it seems. And this was the pinnacle for me of this series. I know other people have different points of view. These were some of the strongest episodes for the characters, for the way they're portrayed, and the events in general. And while I loved them, it bugged me, because I think the creators tied it in too much to our present day, and they turned everything on its end. And instead now of these people being on the run, they were now being occupied by the Cylons. So they tied it into the Iraq war that was going on concurrently at the time of the production. And our heroes were now becoming insurgents. And they were finding ways to
sabotage the enemy.
What was considered the new society that the Cylons had set up. Now, it didn't bother me that they were doing it, and I think I'd be on the same side as they were had I been the same person. It just made it seem like they were taking headlines from present day, which they were tying in our heroes on the show to the Iraqi insurgents, except when you step back, no matter what side of the war you were on or politically minded you are, they're saying now, these people are kind of right, and we're showing you from their point of view, but the people that in real life were our troops that were being attacked by the Iraqi insurgents. So I kind of found it hard to be supportive of this group of insurgents because they're my heroes on a TV show, and then they're making a moral equivalent to what we considered the devils in the real world, killing our troops. So it's blurred a little bit. It bothered me, but I understood it.
I think
and it was very bold of them to do it.
I think the link is obviously there. It's right there in your face. However, I also think that what they were trying to explore was, if you go back to the original series, when the original series starts and the whole thing about the attack is coming and some people, it's not coming, don't worry about it. And there's always this element of, but you know what, and this happens on every sci-fi thing I've ever seen. It's well, why don't we just try to agree with them? Let's see what they want. Let's go along with them. Let's not fight.
Little Neville Chamberlain.
Let's just see what happens. I think that was part of it too. Now, granted, they are flipping it on its head. They're giving you if anybody ever in this particular story feels that, you know what, maybe life under their rule wouldn't be that bad, here's a way of they're showing you. The two options are they exterminate the humans, which is one of the main points, of the story. But then there was let's keep them around and make them work for us. What would that be like? So that's what happens. They get a taste of, here's what happens if you don't fight back. And if they don't kill you, this is the kind of life you're going to have. So obviously, when you have that scenario, that's how you're expected to react. That's how you would expect the heroes to react. On the other hand, yes, it is in your face because you turn on the news back then at that point, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, there is another side of the story. It's what happens when people kind of come into your house and you don't know who they are, and now they're telling you what to do.
I feel those episodes, and I think it was only 3 episodes at the most, if it was even that. And I think one was like an hour and a half.
The occupation episodes?
Yeah.
I think there were a couple of them.
I think they were at their creative and emotional peak at that point. So at the point where Adama comes back, he's sending Apollo and the Pegasus off on its own. Is this going to coordinate properly?
They jump into
do
the
a hard
atmosphere,
jump into the atmosphere,
which was
so
wonderful.
the ships can launch directly to the location and not have to go through like scanners and things like that. And then it was obvious Apollo wasn't going to keep his orders. He comes back, just this bit of a battle royale.
Right.
It was just brilliant. And then you had to deal with the effects of Kara was being held psychologically against her will and all this other baggage. So by the time they get back to the ship when they've won, and just the things that Ty went through, and
lost an eye,
Kara, and Ty has to kill his own wife, and Anders is like a leader coordinating this insurgency, and then like he has to just go back to like regular life now. And that, to me, looking back on it, was where it jumped the proverbial shark, because it couldn't get better than that as far as I was concerned. So unfortunately, it seemed like some of the areas that they went to afterwards, there were still really strong episodes. Looking for the final 5, there were some various things like that. When they finally got Boltar again, that little cat and mouse game, he gets more religious. He's almost like, it's almost a conversion.
He's like a cult leader.
It's like the conversion of Paul in the Bible for Boltar. And now, well, geez, he couldn't be any badder up until that point.
And let's not forget.
And then he kind of starts to see things differently. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, I don't know.
And let's not forget, since the early seasons, and it lasted throughout most of the show, and it peaked a little bit around that time, was Richard Hatch coming back to the show as a completely new character who eventually goes head-to-head against everybody because he wants to take over, and in the process, they lose Mr. Gaeta, switches sides.
Yeah, well, that's where I started to have a problem. Now, Richard Hatch's character was actually a smartly created character. He started out as a terrorist. He was an ambiguous terrorist.
He was a political prisoner, I think. Well, they were saying he's
your
kind of...
political prisoner is my terrorist. Well, and that's the whole point. There was a lot of ambiguity on some things. They tried to tippy-toe back and forth onto certain lines of convention, and he was one of those guys. He was one of those guys who would be similar to some of the people who in the 70s who tried to do certain hit and run attacks on political targets,
like a Weather Underground type of group.
Exactly, that's the type of thing I felt they were trying to tie him into. Well before it was brought back in the news. You know, I guess that was brought back in like during the 2008 election. So they were actually kind of smart in how they dealt with him. And he did a good job, and he was a smart character, and a little bit of intrigue and backstabbing. There was a lot of that kind of stuff, like these characters. But they were being true to the characters, the way they handled them. But it seemed like after New Caprica, some of the characters started to come out of character. And I didn't like how they were handling Saul. I didn't like how they were handling Kara. I didn't like how they were handling certain characters like that. They just seemed to be, they become caricatures of things. And that's the episodes I find a little less popular in my mind. You know, there was a boxing episode. Now, I think the theory was these people are so pent up with frustrations and angst and anger towards one another for various different things that's why that episode was created. I just don't think it was, you know, exposed in quite the manner that made it clear. Then there's later episodes where Boltar becomes a cult figure, and his conversion now I don't know, did he believe it or did he do it out of political expediency?
Well, with him, you never knew his motivation. A lot of it had to do with the visions he was seeing and the voices he kept hearing, which up until the end, they're there. He didn't imagine this stuff. It was happening to him, which was something that in the first few seasons we were always wondering, is he just completely insane?
Or is he a Cylon?
Or is somebody
is
somebody actually prodding him on purpose in this manner, communicating with him? So by the end, you do understand that, yeah, they are prodding him for some bizarre reason.
One of the best characters to come out of those later season episodes, I guess it was probably around season 4 at this point, was a character named Romo Lampkin. And he played the lawyer who had, been affiliated with Joseph Adama. It seemed like there was some sort of connection with Adama's father, Joseph Adama. Even the demons he was dealing with, like there were so many, these people had so many problems on so many levels that at one point it was very moving. His character, like you think he's a side character, a throwaway character, but he's carrying around his dead cat because because people killed the cat for him defending Boltar, but that was the only thing he had left to his wife and to his family.
Right, and
he started to crack. He was a very strong character, it appeared, and even he was starting to crack at this point. So as much as it bugged me that these characters are acting like this, there were some really good performances too. And like I said, by the final season, it just started to seem like, now after the final 5 had been revealed, some of those characters were people who were very well liked by the audience. I found it hard now to imagine, wait a minute, all these things that went on beforehand, and it turned out that guy was a Cylon. Or that guy was a Cylon.
I think they were trying to shock people. They wanted to give you a mystery of who are the final 5, and they obviously didn't want to make it obvious. They wanted to mix it up, give you some important characters and some not so important characters.
Yeah, I had some problems with that, and I think, that's life. It went on. But by the finale, I think they regrouped, and I think the finale was as good as we could have expected at that point. So Boltar is cleared. We've gotten to this, we're probably towards the end of the 4th season now, and they're finding Earth. They finally found Earth. And it turns out another kick to the gut. And Earth is a burnt-out nuclear wasteland. And it's just unbelievable. Like, first of all, how much more can these characters take?
That's the thing. They completely
and as
were
an
losing
audience now, it's like, wow, this is where it ends. It's the Earth they're looking for. This is the finale. Luckily for us, this show wasn't over.
Right, there was a little more. Not only
but
that,
this was the Earth they were looking for.
But you're at a point now in the show where the characters are breaking apart. They're becoming unglued, basically, because emotionally they can't take it. And as that's happening, as I mentioned before, some characters are betraying each other. Some characters kill themselves.
The enemies are joining with the good guys.
Right.
We're supporting these characters, and now suddenly, oh, wait a minute, the stormtroopers are joining with the rebels? It's
not only
it's the
that,
same equivalent.
but the ship itself is falling apart.
And exactly, this whole fracturing
they know
of
that
society,
they don't have much left because the ship is falling
apart.
If the ship falls apart, then they can't protect the fleet.
At one point, they're prepared to leave the ship after all this.
The fleet is toast pretty soon.
Kara has gone off. Kara's thought to be dead. She comes back. Do we believe her? She's a beloved character. She's like a daughter to Adama.
Well,
what does he do?
That's when the stories turn up the religion. Let's call it religion, because it's I don't know if you can call it a supernatural thing, but it's a religious thing, a prophecy thing. In this show, they treat it as truth, as a reality.
It bugged me a little bit because I didn't want to see that in this type of
in other words,
atmosphere.
They will not scientifically explain unexplainable events. They chalk it off to that's their religion. And the only way to explain these unexplainable events, it's our religion.
Well, that's how our society, that's how human society did it.
That's the history of man.
The sun comes up, we don't understand it.
Right.
It's a guy in a chariot.
Until somebody can explain it to you, that's what you call it. And even in this advanced society, but keep in mind, you are seeing some freaky stuff. People don't come back to life after crashing a ship.
Well,
that's
where I was a little dismayed at how it turned out. I didn't know what she was going to be. I was pretty sure she wasn't going to be a Cylon. As a fan of the original series, I had actually hoped somehow there'd be a slight mention of the Ship of Lights. Maybe they don't need to go into it. Maybe they don't have to establish it. But it was somehow would explain that there was another guiding influence of some type. That's fine. And they didn't want to go there. And it's probably smarter not to.
I think they actually went there.
Oh, and they just didn't show it.
They didn't show it. I think that's how
true.
you explain her. That's how you explain
Head Boltar.
Six-Head Boltar. All that stuff. That's how you explain it. It's the unknown
without actually showing
beings.
A ship of lights or a heaven or a guy in white robes with a long beard or something.
It doesn't give you scientific answers, which is annoying to somebody who I like it when things are explained.
And sometimes in life there aren't scientific answers why this happens or we haven't gotten them yet.
I'll tell you what this is exactly like. This is exactly like Lost. Some people, when the show ended, loved it because it went into the realm of the religious, spiritual, and some people didn't like it because they didn't go into the explain the mystery. That's what they're doing here.
If you got A and B, how come it didn't go to
Right.
C?
So they purposely decided, just like they do in many shows, and we talked about this, there's some things they just don't want to explain because, number one, it's very difficult to explain it, and number two, artistically, it's nice sometimes to leave that gap so that people like you and I, for the next 30 freaking years, can come up with 35,000 theories on why it happened.
Well, we finally get to the end of the series. It's been announced it's done. And, how is it going to end? We assume they're going to find Earth. Well, it turns out they find our Earth. And I love how it ended. Let's take aside and they finally end the battle with the Cylons.
Well,
this is now, they're done with that, and they've got to get to Earth.
Where are they, first of all? When are they?
Well, that's the thing. We kind of all suspected they would find our Earth.
Right.
But when? Exactly.
We didn't know when.
Are they going to show up in 1980? Are they going to show up?
Is it the Egyptians? Is it the...
Yes, anything's possible. But it's brilliant, and here's why it's brilliant. They show up essentially at the dawn of man, when man is more tribal,
right?
Doesn't have a proper language, is nomadic,
right?
Very primitive,
pre-civilization,
very primitive, basic life functions.
Plus, they say that they purposely destroy most of the technology because they don't want to influence what's happening there.
But there's always been this theory, another theory on how you have the religious theories of how mankind was created.
Right.
You have some proven and not so proven scientific theories, and then you have these other people who have felt over time that either other civilizations, aliens. I mean, when you say it that way, when you say aliens seeded the Earth because so many things were similar and unexplained yet different throughout this planet. Nazca, art, pyramids with technology that was a little more advanced than other places in that time, how certain Egyptian things were built mathematically, that it didn't seem like, even though they had that,
it didn't belong.
Maybe it shouldn't. So I'm not saying I believe that, but I'm willing to at least believe it. And when I finally saw it on screen, I loved it because here they said, look, okay, we're going to work ourselves in and we're going to mingle with the primitives and we're going to destroy our technology. And we're basically going to start fresh.
They spread out.
Now, clearly, there would still be, the initial people, hello, here we are, nice to meet you. And it would just go on. And there would be tribalism. And if you were part of the Galactica and you were in South America, you might have the same technology as if you were in North Africa or in, Central Europe or various other things. So it made perfect sense. This is how that would tie in. And the rest is history. I just loved that ending because that's a plausible possibility on how that,
Plus, the other thing is that they give you a little coda at the end where you see Baltar and Six in modern day
talking about how
Manhattan.
Well, that was a theme that we didn't get to touch on too much. Towards the end, they had, this has all happened before, and it will all happen again.
And it's a theme that always has continued in the show.
This was landing on the planet and destroying everything was Adama's way of trying to stop that from happening. But you can't. Sometimes things just happen. And in our present day society, everything is iPad and robotic, and things are heading much more towards technology to the point where I feel if we could create our own robotic army of some sorts and then lose control of it, I guess, which is what happened.
Well, that's the theme of this show. Is
that's
that
what's going to happen.
Technology eventually.
They're insinuating that's what could happen again.
Right. The theme of the show is not so much a self-destructive, nuclear wasteland type of message. Even though when they find Earth, that's what they find. But what kind is it? Is it they destroyed each other between humans, or is it that it always leads to the humans creating robots and the robots taking it out on the humans again?
And it
wanted to become
independent.
Like
that's the pattern in these shows, and it was
you create a slave society, and the slave society turns on you.
Like, I don't think we're going to get to it today, but they kind of show the creation of the Caprican Cylons later on in the show called Caprica, which has its own pluses and minuses. But yeah, I just think the ending was very satisfying. I loved watching the show again a second time because I didn't have to wait and I could take it all in. And I think sometimes when you have to wait on a show over a summer or a year sometimes, you lose certain nuances. But also, I think that probably would have helped. The first time I didn't notice how much I disliked certain character changes because time had passed. I just wasn't even thinking about it that way. Seeing it all together, it's like, hey, wait a minute, this happened too quick. I now am a big fan of Ron Moore and his crew and how they put this together. And to me, it's a success.
I'm going to wrap this up with a quick trivia fact. One of the characters you seem to like was Roma Lampkin. Romo is short for Ron Moore.
Is that how it came?
That's how his name came about.
That's great.
Now, as soon as this show was over, this series was over, pretty quickly, a few months later, somebody announced that Bryan Singer wanted to do a movie.
And it doesn't make sense.
And at the time, it was like, what?
And he said it's going to be more like the original. But he wasn't going to do a sequel to the original. He was just going to do another new Galactica. I think now people are just saying, "Oh, Galactica, let's see if we can milk it."
I
also know Bryan Singer is working on a $6 Million Man, and he's probably got another Superman and an X-Men. Yeah. So it seems like he's a guy who constantly comes up with these great ideas.
As of now, I haven't seen too much progress on it. Even though every now and then it pops up that they're developing. We'll see what happens.
I think a little time to breathe would be.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, nowadays, everything gets announced right away. You know, Batman hasn't even ended and they already announced rebooting it. Superman had a film recently. It's already being rebooted next year. You know, so at the same time, it wouldn't surprise me if they do. But we'll see what happens. I mean, this is the type of show that I never would have imagined they would have had successfully rebooted it, and they did.
Well, it just proves, like we said in previous episodes, it's a strong story, and that they're popular characters. So it's like Star Trek. If you keep putting it out there, people will come because they like that world. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure we'll say right now, I can't believe they would do it, but we'll check it out.
Definitely. That's what we're here for. Well, I'd like to thank James for joining us today on this examination of the rebooted Battlestar Galactica, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and listening to our rants of all of this sci-fi weird stuff that we're into. So we'll see you here next time when we do another one of these shows on Geek Fest Rants. Bye-bye.
Moments ago, this ship received word. A Cylon attack against our home world is underway.
Humanity's children are returning home today.
Sagittarian, how many have you got?
5,251 survivors from Sagittarian last count.
It had been years since anyone had heard from the Cylons. And in an instant, everything we knew was gone.
There are less than 50,000 of us left.
This war is over. We lost.
Now we're on the run.
Yes, we're tired. Yes, the Cylons keep coming after us time after time. And yes, we are still expected to do our jobs.
Our enemy, our own creation, is a bigger threat than we'd ever imagined.
There's at least one Cylon aboard the Galactica.
No mistakes. And be careful out there.
People are getting crazy. Clear your heads.
You said you had a way of detecting human from Cylon. Do you or don't you?
Humanity's very survival rests in your hands.
You're still acting like you're everyone's best friend. Be careful out there. Good hunting is what you say.
Did you wake up somewhere you don't know? How you got there or anything? You're drunk.
You heard the rumors. Cylons who look like humans, sleeper agents hiding in the fleet.
I'm getting a bad feeling about where this is headed.
Let Galactica know we have a problem out here.
They've been tracking the ship all along.
The whole ship knows about you and the chief.
Put a stop to it.
Man takes responsibility for his actions. He accepts the consequences and lives with it every day.
I'm going to Galactica. I need a shot in or out of the cockpit.
You are right on the edge, Thrace. Careful you don't fall off.
Veer away, starboard!
There's no choice. It's either them or us.
Without all the risk, life is so dull.
Do it.
This is the first day of the new era.
Stop.